There are places on this earth where the wind has no name, where the cold is not a season, but a permanent state of being, where the sky presses down so hard against the peaks that clouds and stone seem to share the same breath. These are the high places, the forgotten places, the places where most living things have long since surrendered and retreated to lower, gentler ground. And yet, something remains here. Something watches from the ridgeline. Something moves through the frozen silence with such perfect, practiced grace that the mountain itself seems unaware of its presence. We have given it many names across the centuries. In Tibet, it is called Shan, the mountain cat. In Mongolia, Irbiz. In parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan, Barfani cheetah, the snow leopard, the leopard of the snows. But perhaps the most honest name it has ever been given is the one that researchers, naturalists, and the people who have spent their lives searching for it most often use: the ghost. Not because it is supernatural, not because it defies the laws of biology or physics, but because, in a very real and measurable sense, it disappears. You can walk through its territory for weeks and find its tracks, its scrape marks, its scent deposits on rocks, the remains of its kills, all the evidence of a living, breathing animal, and never once see the animal itself. You can set camera traps across entire mountain ranges and wait months for a single frame. You can hire guides who have spent their entire lives in these mountains and ask them how many snow leopards they have seen with their own eyes. And many of them will hold up one hand and use only a few fingers. This is the story of that animal. This is an attempt, careful, honest, and humble, to understand what it is, how it lives, why it matters, and what is happening to it as the world it inhabits begins to change in ways that even the most adaptable of creatures cannot easily absorb. To understand the snow leopard, you first have to understand the landscape it calls home, because the two are inseparable. The animal and the mountain are not simply cohabitants. They are partners in a relationship forged over millions of years, shaped by the same geological forces, refined by the same evolutionary pressures. The snow leopard is not merely an animal that lives in the mountains. It is, in a very real biological sense, a mountain. The range of the snow leopard stretches across 12 countries in Central and South Asia: Afghanistan, Bhutan, China, India, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia, Nepal, Pakistan, Russia, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Within those countries, its habitat spans approximately 2 million square kilometers, an area larger than Mexico. It occupies elevations ranging from roughly 3,000 to 500 meters above sea level, though individuals have been recorded above 6,000 meters in conditions where even acclimatized human mountaineers struggle to think clearly or move without supplemental oxygen. This is the domain of the high alpine and subalpine zones. It is a world defined by extremes. Temperatures can swing 60 degrees Celsius between summer and winter. In the coldest months, winds on exposed ridges can exceed 100 kilometers per hour. Snowfall accumulates to depths that would bury a standing adult human. The rocky terrain, shale slopes, granite cliffs, moraine fields deposited by glaciers that have been retreating for decades, offers almost no shelter from the elements and almost no vegetation capable of sustaining large prey animals for most of the year. And yet the snow leopard thrives here. Or rather, it has evolved to not merely survive here, but to operate here with a level of physical mastery that no other large predator on Earth can match at these elevations. Every part of its body is a solution to a specific problem posed by the mountain environment, and when you study each adaptation in detail, you begin to understand that this animal is not simply impressive. It is the product of an almost incomprehensibly long process of refinement that has produced something close to a biological masterpiece. Start with the fur. The snow leopard's coat is one of the most sophisticated thermal management systems in the animal kingdom. The base layer, the underfur, is dense to a degree that is difficult to overstate. It traps air in microscopic pockets that function as insulation, keeping body heat close to the skin even when external temperatures plunge below -30 degrees Celsius. Over this underfur lies a longer outer coat, the guard hairs, which are hollow and serve as a secondary insulating layer while also providing waterproofing. The fur on the belly is particularly long, sometimes reaching 12 centimeters, which provides protection when the animal lies on snow or ice for extended periods. The overall coloration, a pale smoky gray dappled with dark rosettes and spots, is not merely beautiful. It is a functional camouflage of extraordinary effectiveness, breaking up the animal's outline against the broken visual texture of rock, snow, and shadow. But the fur is only the beginning. Look at the feet. The paws of a snow leopard are enormous relative to body size, larger in proportion than those of any other wild cat. They function as natural snowshoes, distributing the animal's weight across a wider surface area, preventing it from sinking into deep snow with each step. Between the toes and on the pads, additional fur grows in dense tufts, providing both insulation and traction on ice. The paws are also partially retractable. The claws can be extended for gripping rock or prey and retracted while walking to preserve their sharpness, exactly as in domestic cats, but scaled to the demands of a predator that must negotiate near vertical cliff faces while carrying prey. The tail deserves particular attention because it is not simply a balance organ, though it performs that function superbly. The snow leopard's tail is one of the longest relative to body length of any felid, often measuring between 80 and 105 centimeters, roughly equal to the animal's body length. It is extraordinarily thick, with a dense fat deposit that serves as an energy reserve and additional insulation. In cold conditions, the animal wraps its tail around its body and face while resting, essentially creating an additional layer of insulation that supplements the fur coat. On rocky terrain, the tail functions as a dynamic counterweight, adjusting moment by moment as the animal moves across unstable surfaces, enabling a level of agility that seems to defy physics. The chest cavity and respiratory system of a snow leopard are enlarged relative to body size, an adaptation that allows the animal to extract sufficient oxygen from the thin air at high altitude. The nasal passages are wide, allowing more air to be processed with each breath. The sinuses are large, warming inhaled air before it reaches the delicate lung tissue. These adaptations are convergent with those found in other high-altitude mammals, yaks, Tibetan antelope, certain species of hare, but in the snow leopard, they are combined with the musculature and reflexes of an apex predator, creating an animal that can sprint, leap, and fight at altitudes where most other large predators would be gasping. The limbs are powerfully built, with hind legs that are disproportionately long and muscular, giving the snow leopard a crouched, ready posture even when walking casually and enabling leaps of up to 15 meters horizontally and 9 meters vertically. Consider what that means in practical terms. A snow leopard can clear a distance of 15 meters in a single bound from a standing start on the side of a mountain in thin air, carrying enough power to bring down an animal 3 times its own weight in a world where the terrain is almost entirely vertical, where prey may be found on ledges above or below, where pursuit means navigating cliff faces at speed. This capacity is not a luxury, it is survival. The eyes are pale, often a striking pale, green, gray, or amber, with large pupils that can dilate to extraordinary degrees, gathering maximum light in the low visibility conditions of dawn, dusk, and blizzard. The retinas are equipped with a high density of rod cells, optimized for light sensitivity over color discrimination, making the snow leopard an effective hunter in near darkness, and the ability to track fast-moving objects. A baharal bounding across a slope, a markhor navigating a rock face, is acute to a degree that allows the snow leopard to calculate intercept trajectories across complex 3-dimensional terrain in real time. All of these physical qualities combine with a behavioral repertoire shaped by tens of thousands of generations of solitary hunting in one of the most demanding environments on the planet. The snow leopard is not simply an athletic animal. It is an intelligent, patient, highly strategic predator whose success rate in hunts is meaningfully higher than many better studied large cats. Despite operating in terrain that would seem to offer advantages to prey as much as to predator, understanding how the snow leopard hunts requires understanding its primary prey species, because the two are locked in an evolutionary arms race that has been running for as long as both have existed in the mountains. The principal prey of the snow leopard varies by geography, but across its range, the dominant prey species include the blue sheep, also called baral, which is found across the Himalayas and Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayan tahr, a large ungulate adapted to cliff environments, the ibex in Central Asian ranges, argali, the largest wild sheep in the world, found across the high plateaus of Central Asia, Urial in lower ranges, and markhor, the spectacular spiral-horned wild goat of Pakistan and Afghanistan. In some areas, particularly at lower elevations or in winter, when primary prey moves down the slopes, snow leopards also take smaller mammals, marmots, hares, pikas, and occasionally domestic livestock, a behavior with profound consequences for their relationship with human communities. The baral is perhaps the most important prey species across the broadest portion of the snow leopard's range, and it is worth examining in some detail because its own adaptations tell you something about what the snow leopard is dealing with when it hunts. The baral is not a helpless animal. It is powerfully built, sure-footed on terrain that would challenge even experienced technical climbers, capable of speeds of over 40 kilometers per hour on rocky slopes and equipped with excellent vision. A group of baral on a cliff face is not a collection of easy targets. It is a community of alert, agile animals with multiple pairs of eyes scanning every direction, where each individual's survival depends on the collective vigilance of the group. This is why the snow leopard hunts the way it does, not with speed or power as a first resort, but with patience, concealment, and planning. The typical hunt begins long before the attack. It begins with observation. A snow leopard will often spend hours, sometimes the better part of a day, watching a group of prey animals from a distance, reading their behavior, noting which individuals stray from the group, which move toward terrain that offers the predator an approach route, which appear weakened or distracted. This is not instinct operating mechanically. This is something that looks uncomfortably like deliberate assessment, strategic thinking adapted to the demands of a particular environment. When the animal has identified its opportunity, it begins a stalk that can last an hour. The approach is along the wind, always into or across the wind, never downwind, where scent would betray the predator. The route is chosen to minimize exposure along ridges where the silhouette is broken by rock through depressions and gullies that provide concealment, always using the terrain as cover. The movement is extraordinarily slow during the early phases of the approach. A body that can sprint 15 meters in a second instead creeps forward centimeter by centimeter, pausing motionless for minutes at a time when prey animals raise their heads to scan. The rosette pattern on the coat, which seemed decorative at a distance, now reveals its function completely. At 10 meters on a rocky slope, a motionless snow leopard is effectively invisible. At some point, usually when the distance to the target animal has been reduced to within 30 meters, often much less, the stalk transitions to the sprint. And here the snow leopard's physical gifts become fully apparent. The acceleration from stillness to full speed is explosive, the kind of burst that uses fast twitch muscle fibers built specifically for this moment. The approach across broken terrain is navigated not by cautious calculation, but by a millisecond by millisecond adjustment of balance, powered by the tail and enabled by paws that grip rock with the sureness of a skilled climber's hands. The target animal, if it detects the predator at all, has perhaps 2 seconds to react. The kill, when it comes, is delivered by a bite to the back of the neck or the throat, a technique that severs the spinal cord or suffocates the prey by collapsing the windpipe. The snow leopard does not have the sheer bite force of a tiger or a lion, but it has more than sufficient power to dispatch even the largest baral or tar. After the kill, the animal typically drags the carcass to a sheltered location, a cave, an overhang, a dense patch of vegetation, returning repeatedly to the same carcass rather than hunting again immediately. A single large kill can sustain a snow leopard for a week or more, which is significant in an environment where successful hunts may come only every 10 to 15 days. The solitary nature of the snow leopard deserves careful consideration because it shapes everything about the animal's ecology, social structure, and relationship with the landscape. Unlike lions, which live in cooperatively structured prides, or wolves, which operate in coherent hierarchical packs, the snow leopard's world is essentially one of profound solitude. Adult individuals interact rarely, and when they do, those interactions are brief, carefully managed, and governed by a complex system of chemical and visual communication that renders actual physical contact largely unnecessary. Territory is marked through a variety of methods. Scrapes, patches of ground where the animal has raked with its hind feet, depositing scent from interdigital glands, are found at regular intervals along travel routes and at prominent landscape features. Spray marks, where urine and anal gland secretions are deposited on rocks and vegetation at nose height, create olfactory signposts that communicate the identity, sex, and reproductive status of the marking individual to any snow leopard that passes by. Scratch marks on trees and rock faces serve a similar function. Scat, often deposited in highly visible locations on prominent rocks or at trail intersections, is another form of communication. The cumulative effect of all this marking is to create a landscape that is, for a snow leopard, richly legible. A text written in scent and sign that tells any passing individual who else is using this terrain when they were last here, whether a female is reproductively receptive, whether a male is large and likely to contest a territory. This information network allows snow leopards to coordinate their use of space, avoid unnecessary conflict, and find mates during the brief mating season. all without the risk and energy cost of frequent direct encounters. Home ranges vary enormously depending on prey density and terrain, but research using satellite GPS collars has revealed ranges far larger than earlier estimates suggested. In areas of low prey density, such as parts of Mongolia, individual snow leopards have been tracked across ranges exceeding 1,000 square kilometers. In prey-rich areas like parts of Nepal's Himalayan ranges, territories can be considerably smaller, sometimes under 100 square kilometers. Males generally hold larger territories than females, and a male's territory typically overlaps with those of several females, which is the functional basis of the species' mating system. The mating season occurs between January and March, when the cold is at its most intense and the mountain world is at its most austere. During this period, the usual rules of solitude are briefly suspended. Males follow female scent trails across the landscape, sometimes traveling far outside their normal range in search of a receptive female. When a male and female do meet, the interaction is prolonged, sometimes lasting several days, and is characterized by vocalizations, mutual grooming, and behavior that appears, to human observers, remarkably gentle for large predators. Snow leopards do not roar. Their laryngeal anatomy differs from the great roaring cats. Instead, they produce a range of vocalizations, including yowls, chuffs, a sound made by pushing air through the nostrils, used as a friendly greeting in domestic cats as well, growls, and a haunting carrying call, sometimes described as a prustin, a sound that travels across mountain valleys in the winter darkness and has been the source of countless legends among the people who live in these places. After mating, the male plays no role in the raising of offspring. The female selects a den, typically a rock crevice, a cave, or a sheltered overhang with good sight lines, and prepares it with a lining of her own fur. The gestation period is approximately 90 to 100 days. Litter sizes range from 1 to 5 cubs, with 2 or 3 being most common. Cubs are born in spring or early summer, timing their arrival to coincide with the warming of the mountains and the beginning of the period when prey animals will be most numerous and accessible. The cubs are born helpless, eyes closed, ears folded, entirely dependent on the mother for warmth, nutrition, and protection. Their survival during the first weeks of life depends entirely on the mother's ability to remain with them, which means a sustained period without hunting, during which the female draws on fat reserves built up before and during pregnancy. The mortality rate in this early period is significant. Exposure, starvation, if the mother is injured or killed, predation by wolves or other carnivores, and only a fraction of cubs survive to independence. Those that do survive begin a long apprenticeship in the art of mountain survival. By the time they are 3 months old, the cubs are mobile and beginning to explore the area around the den. By 6 months, they are accompanying their mother on portions of her hunting expeditions, learning through observation the techniques she uses, the patient stalking, the reading of terrain, the approach into the wind, the explosive final sprint. This is not simply play. It is an extended educational process without which the cubs cannot survive as independent adults, and it lasts until the cubs are 18 to 24 months old, unusually long for a fillet of this size. During this learning period, the relationship between mother and cubs is the central social unit of snow leopard existence, the only extended cooperative bond the species forms. The female defends her cubs with ferocity that belies her usually cautious demeanor and has been documented driving off wolves, other snow leopards, and even confronting humans who approach too closely to a den site. The cubs, for their part, engage in play behaviors that closely mirror adult hunting techniques. Stalking, pouncing, wrestling, which serve the dual function of physical conditioning and skills development. Watching a pair of snow leopard cubs play on a mountainside is to watch, in an accelerated and obviously joyful form, the rehearsal of every technique that will determine their survival as adults. When the cubs finally separate from their mother, typically around 20 months of age, each enters a period of what researchers call dispersal, a phase during which the young animal must find and establish a territory of its own. This is perhaps the most dangerous period in a snow leopard's life. The young animal must navigate terrain it has not fully explored, avoid established adults defending their territories, learn to hunt independently without the safety net of returning to a mother's kill, and do all of this while its own skills are still not fully developed. Mortality during dispersal is high, and many young snow leopards do not survive this period. Those that do establish themselves in suitable habitat, finding a patch of terrain with adequate prey, sufficient cover, and not already fully occupied by an established adult, begin the long process of building a territory, learning its nuances, improving their hunting efficiency, and eventually, if they survive long enough, finding mates and contributing their genes to the next generation. A wild snow leopard that successfully navigates all of these challenges can live 12 to 17 years. In captivity, individuals have reached 21 years. The maximum recorded lifespan in the wild is not known with certainty because the difficulty of studying these animals means that many individuals are never tracked continuously enough to document their entire life history. The relationship between snow leopards and the human communities that share their landscape is one of the most complex and consequential aspects of the species' ecology, and it cannot be understood in simple terms of predator and prey, conflict and coexistence. The mountain communities of the Himalayas, the Hindu Kush, the Karakoram, the Pamirs, and the other ranges where snow leopards live are themselves products of an extraordinarily demanding environment. These are communities that have existed at high altitude for centuries or millennia, that have developed cultures, economies, and worldviews shaped by the specific challenges of mountain life. Their relationship with the snow leopard is old, layered, and deeply ambivalent in ways that outsiders often misunderstand. On one level, the snow leopard is a spiritual and cultural presence. In Tibetan Buddhism, which pervades much of the cultural landscape across the Himalayan belt, the snow leopard occupies a position of reverence associated with qualities of power, grace, and elusiveness that carry spiritual resonance. In many communities, there are traditions against killing snow leopards, grounded not in modern conservation thinking, but in ancient systems of belief that recognize the mountain predators as part of a sacred order. These traditions have varied enormously across cultures and have not, by any means, uniformly protected the species. Poaching has occurred within Buddhist communities, as in any other, but they represent an important cultural infrastructure for conservation that has received insufficient attention from outside researchers and organizations. On another level, the snow leopard is a predator that kills livestock, and in mountain communities where every animal represents a significant economic and social investment, livestock predation is not a minor inconvenience. It is a potentially devastating event. A family in rural Ladakh, or the upper Mustang region of Nepal, or the high valleys of Pakistan's Gilgit-Baltistan region may own a small number of goats, sheep, or yaks, that represent the majority of their productive assets, their source of milk, wool, meat, and agricultural labor. When a snow leopard enters a livestock corral and kills multiple animals in a single night, which happens because the enclosed space triggers what researchers call surplus killing behavior, the economic impact on that family can be severe and long-lasting. The human response to livestock predation by snow leopards has historically included retaliatory killing, hunting down, and killing the individual responsible, or in some cases, killing any snow leopard that could be found in the area. In some regions, snow leopards have also been targeted for the illegal wildlife trade, where skins, bones, and other body parts command prices that represent years of income for a mountain household. Both of these factors have contributed to significant population decline over the past century, to the point where the species was listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List for decades, a status that was revised to vulnerable in 2017, reflecting some recovery, but not a return to historical population levels. The current global population of snow leopards is estimated at somewhere between 4,000 and 6,500 individuals, a range that reflects the genuine uncertainty involved in counting an animal this elusive across a range this vast. This estimate is based on a combination of camera trap surveys, sign-based surveys, and statistical modeling, and it represents substantial improvement in methodology compared to earlier estimates, but it remains imprecise. What is not in dispute is that the population is fragmented, with isolated subpopulations in different mountain ranges that have limited or no genetic exchange with each other, a situation that is concerning from the perspective of long-term genetic health and the species' ability to respond to environmental change. The threats facing the snow leopard are multiple, interconnected, and in several cases accelerating. Habitat loss and fragmentation driven by infrastructure development, roads, mining operations, hydroelectric projects is reducing the effective size and connectivity of available habitat across much of the species range. Poaching for the illegal wildlife trade continues despite international legal protections under CITES and national laws in all 12 range states. Climate change is altering the high-altitude ecosystems on which the snow leopard depends in ways that are already measurable and that are projected to accelerate dramatically over coming decades. And the intensification of human-wildlife conflict as growing human populations and changing land use patterns bring more domestic animals into snow leopard territory is increasing the pressure that drives retaliatory killing. Of all these threats, climate change may prove to be the most fundamental because it operates on the species' habitat at a level that no local conservation measure can fully address. The Himalayas and adjacent mountain ranges are warming at a rate significantly faster than the global average, a phenomenon sometimes called elevation-dependent warming, in which higher elevations experience greater temperature increases per unit of global warming than lower elevations. This means that the specific thermal niche that snow leopards occupy, the zone between the tree line and the permanent snowpack, is being squeezed from both below and above. As temperatures rise, vegetation moves upslope, compressing the alpine zone. The snowline retreats, reducing the extent of the habitat that the snow leopard's adaptations have optimized it to exploit. This is not a hypothetical future scenario. It is happening now, and its effects are already visible in changing prey distributions, altered migration patterns, and in some areas, the detection of snow leopards at higher elevations than were previously recorded. Animals pushed upslope by changes in the habitat below In the long term, the projections for the snow leopard's habitat under various warming scenarios are sobering. Studies have estimated that the species could lose between 30 and 60% of its current habitat within the century under high-emission scenarios, a loss that would, given current population fragmentation, likely result in multiple local extinctions and a severe contraction of the species range. The glaciers of the Himalayas and Karakoram are among the most extensive outside the polar regions. They have been the subject of intense scientific scrutiny for decades, and the picture that research has assembled is unambiguous. These glaciers are losing mass at an accelerating rate. Some smaller glaciers have already disappeared entirely. Others have retreated by kilometers in the past century. The meltwater from these glaciers feeds the rivers that irrigate the agricultural lowlands of South Asia, the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, supporting agriculture for populations numbering in the hundreds of millions. In the short term, accelerating glacier melt increases river flows, which can cause flooding. In the longer term, as glaciers diminish, dry season river flows will decline, threatening the water security of entire civilizations built around rivers born in the mountains. For the snow leopard, glacier retreat means the loss of a specific type of habitat, the zone adjacent to glacial ice, where the cold is most intense and where prey animals congregate in summer to escape heat and insects. It means altered snowpack dynamics that change the difficulty of winter movement across the landscape. It means changes in the vegetation communities that support prey animals. These changes are not happening in isolation. They are part of a systemic transformation of high-altitude ecosystems that is occurring faster than most of the species inhabiting those ecosystems can adapt through evolutionary processes alone. The concept of climate velocity, the speed at which organisms must move to track the shifting location of their preferred climate conditions, is instructive here. As temperatures rise, the zones of climate that different species are adapted to move upslope and poleward. Species that can disperse quickly enough can theoretically track these shifting zones. Species that cannot disperse fast enough, either because of physical limitations or because habitat barriers prevent movement, are exposed to climatic conditions outside their adaptive range. For snow leopards, the upslope movement of their thermal niche is bounded above by the limits of terrain. There is only so high a mountain goes, and the movement of prey species, which ultimately determines where snow leopards can live, adds another layer of complexity that makes simple projections inadequate. Research conducted over the past decade by teams from institutions including the Snow Leopard Trust, WWF, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and multiple Asian universities has begun to map these dynamics in detail. Camera trap networks deployed at varying elevations along altitudinal gradients document how snow leopard occurrence changes over years as conditions shift. Prey surveys track the movement of Baral ibex and other key species in response to vegetation changes. Climate models, downscaled to the resolution of individual mountain ranges, project future habitat availability under different greenhouse gas concentration scenarios. The synthesis of all this work produces a picture that is detailed, nuanced, and deeply concerning. One finding that has emerged consistently from this research is that the populations of snow leopards most at risk are those already occupying the margins of the species range, the southern edges of the Himalayas, where temperatures are already closer to the species' thermal limits, and the lower elevation portions of the range in Central Asia, where habitat is already fragmented by human activity. These marginal populations are doubly vulnerable. exposed to greater climate stress, and less connected to other populations by movement corridors that might allow rescue through immigration if local conditions deteriorate. Conversely, some research suggests that certain high-elevation areas in the core of the species range, particularly parts of the Tibetan Plateau and the high Pamirs, may remain climatically suitable for snow leopards much longer than the margins and could serve as refugia from which recolonization of lower areas might be possible if conditions eventually stabilize. This has led to calls for a conservation strategy that explicitly prioritizes the protection of these potential refugia, ensuring that they remain intact and accessible, that human pressure within them is minimized, and that movement corridors connecting them to each other are maintained. The illegal wildlife trade represents a more immediate and direct threat to individual snow leopards, and understanding its dynamics requires moving beyond simple narratives of villainous poachers and innocent prey. The trade in snow leopard skins and body parts is driven by demand from multiple markets. Fashion consumers who value the fur for its beauty and rarity, traditional medicine practitioners, and their patients who believe that leopard bones, like tiger bones, which the snow leopard's parts are sometimes used to substitute for, have therapeutic properties, and a smaller luxury market for whole skins and taxidermied specimens. The supply chain that connects a snow leopard killed in a remote mountain valley to a consumer in a distant market involves multiple intermediaries, crosses international borders, and is embedded in criminal networks that also traffic in other goods. For the hunter who pulls the trigger or sets the snare, typically a local person with limited economic alternatives, facing significant personal risk. The motivation is almost always economic. The price received at the point of harvest is a fraction of the final retail value of the product, which may be many thousands of dollars, but it still represents more money than most mountain households earn in months or years from legitimate activities. This economic calculus will not change through enforcement alone. It requires either a reduction in demand achieved through consumer education campaigns and cultural change, or the creation of legitimate economic alternatives that provide comparable income from a living snow leopard, which is precisely the logic of wildlife tourism programs. Enforcement efforts have had measurable impact in some areas, particularly where national governments have invested significantly in wildlife crime units and border controls. In India, the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau has disrupted multiple snow leopard trafficking networks and achieved convictions that have set meaningful legal precedents. In China, enforcement within national parks has been substantially strengthened. In Nepal, community anti-poaching monitoring programs involving local people in wildlife protection have detected and prevented poaching attempts that formal law enforcement would likely have missed. But enforcement faces inherent limitations in landscapes this vast and remote. The mountains where snow leopards live are not easily patrolled. The borders between range countries are often poorly monitored. Corruption within enforcement agencies is a persistent problem, and the demand for wildlife products in consumer markets continues to drive the economic incentive that motivates suppliers despite the legal risks. Significant progress on illegal trade will require sustained effort on both supply and demand sides simultaneously, a recognition that has slowly worked its way into international conservation policy, but that has not yet translated into adequately resourced action. The question of how many snow leopards actually exist in the wild, a question that might seem basic, but that turns out to be one of the most technically challenging in conservation biology, deserves extended consideration because the answer matters enormously for conservation policy, and because the history of efforts to answer it illustrates both the difficulty of studying this species and the genuine progress that modern methods have enabled. The first scientific estimates of global snow leopard population, produced in the 1970s and 1980s, were based largely on expert opinion, indirect evidence, and extrapolation from very limited survey data. These early estimates ranged widely from 3,500 to 7,000 individuals and carried enormous uncertainty that was rarely acknowledged explicitly. They were not wrong in the sense of being fabricated. They were wrong in the more subtle sense of conveying a precision and confidence that the underlying data did not support. For decades, conservation advocacy relied on these figures without sufficient acknowledgement of their limitations. The development of camera trap surveys, combined with mark recapture statistical methods originally developed for estimating populations of individually identifiable animals, began to provide genuinely rigorous local population density estimates in the late 1990s and 2000s. The approach relies on the fact that individual snow leopards can be identified from their unique spot patterns, much as individual tigers are identified from stripe patterns, or individual cheetahs from facial spot patterns. When camera traps deployed across a study area record the same individual multiple times, statistical models can use the frequency of these recaptures to estimate the total number of individuals present in the area, including those that were never captured. These localized density estimates, when aggregated across suitable habitat areas identified through remote sensing and expert knowledge of the species' habitat preferences, produce range-wide population estimates. The most comprehensive recent estimate, published by the Snow Leopard Trust and collaborating organizations, suggests a global population of approximately 4,000 to 6,500 individuals, with the uncertainty range reflecting both statistical uncertainty in the density estimates and uncertainty about the extent and quality of suitable habitat. This range is considerably narrower and more rigorously supported than earlier estimates, but it still carries meaningful uncertainty that should inform how it is used in policy discussions. One important implication of this improved population estimate is that the snow leopard was almost certainly never as abundant as its vast range might suggest. With a global population of perhaps 5,000 individuals spread across 2 million square kilometers of habitat, the species naturally exists at very low densities, a consequence of the low productivity of high-altitude ecosystems, which cannot support the prey densities that sustain higher predator densities in more productive environments. This means that even without any human-caused population reduction, the snow leopard would be a naturally rare animal, and that the addition of human hunting pressure, habitat loss, and prey depletion on top of this natural rarity has pushed the species into a situation where further losses could have disproportionate genetic and demographic consequences. The science of population genetics has added crucial nuance to this picture. DNA analysis of samples collected across the species range has revealed that the global population is not a single interbreeding unit, but a collection of partially isolated subpopulations between which gene flow is limited by the mountain geography and by human-modified landscape barriers. The degree of genetic differentiation between these subpopulations varies. Some adjacent populations show relatively low genetic differentiation, suggesting reasonably frequent movement of individuals between them. Others show higher differentiation, indicating more prolonged isolation. The conservation implications of this genetic structure are significant. Subpopulations that are highly isolated face the risk of inbreeding depression, a reduction in fitness caused by the increased expression of harmful recessive alleles when closely related individuals mate. They also face reduced adaptive potential because the genetic variation that enables populations to respond to novel challenges, new diseases, changed climatic conditions, new prey species, is lower in genetically impoverished populations than in genetically diverse ones, and isolated populations face a higher risk of local extinction from stochastic events, disease outbreaks, extreme weather, temporary prey crashes, because there is no immigration from adjacent populations to rescue them. Maintaining or restoring genetic connectivity between subpopulations is therefore a priority that complements the direct protection of individual animals and local habitat areas. This requires identifying and protecting the specific landscape corridors through which animals move between subpopulations, typically mountain passes, river valleys, or other features of the topography that provide routes through otherwise inhospitable terrain. These corridors are often narrow, and their disruption by a road, a mine, or a fence can sever connectivity that took thousands of years to establish. Protecting them requires integrating genetic data with landscape analysis and working with government agencies responsible for infrastructure development to ensure that critical corridors are avoided or that mitigation measures are implemented where avoidance is not possible. The role of protected areas in snow leopard conservation is substantial, but also limited in ways that are important to understand. The species range encompasses a large number of national parks, wildlife reserves, and other formally protected areas in all 12 range countries. These areas provide legal protection for habitat and wildlife within their boundaries, and in many cases, they contain populations of snow leopards that are more secure from direct human disturbance than populations in unprotected areas. The expansion and strengthening of protected area networks has been a central element of conservation strategy for the species. However, the snow leopard's ecology poses fundamental challenges to a protected area-only approach. Home ranges of individual animals, particularly in low prey density areas, can be so large that even substantial protected areas contain only a few individuals. Animals routinely move outside protected area boundaries, both in the course of normal ranging behavior and in response to seasonal prey movements, exposing them to the full range of threats present in unprotected landscapes. And the connectivity between protected areas, the corridors through which animals move from one protected area to another, often runs through unprotected land where development, human activity, and hunting pose ongoing risks. This recognition has driven a shift in conservation thinking toward landscape-scale approaches that treat protected areas not as islands, but as nodes within a larger matrix of managed land, including community conservation areas, buffer zones, and connectivity corridors that together constitute a functional conservation landscape. This landscape approach requires working not just with protected area managers, but with communities, local governments, national ministries, and private landholders across vast areas. A governance challenge that is considerably more complex than managing a single protected area, but that is essential if the species' long-term viability is to be secured. The Global Snow Leopard and Ecosystem Protection Program, launched at a Heads of Government meeting in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan in 2013, represents the most comprehensive international attempt to implement this landscape approach. GSLEP brought together all 12 range country governments behind a common framework that sets targets for the conservation of 20 landscapes supporting viable snow leopard populations by 2020 and establishes principles for transboundary cooperation, community engagement, and ecosystem-based management. Progress toward these targets has been uneven. Some countries have made substantial investments in landscape conservation, while others have lagged. But the existence of the framework itself represents a significant political achievement in a region where international cooperation on environmental issues has historically been difficult to sustain. One of the most innovative and promising approaches to emerge from conservation programs working in snow leopard habitat is the use of payments for ecosystem services, mechanisms by which the people who protect or sustainably manage ecosystems receive compensation for the value that their stewardship generates for society at large. The logic is straightforward. If a mountain community maintains the forest and grassland cover that regulates water flow into downstream rivers, thereby protecting agricultural productivity and reducing flood risk for millions of people in the lowlands, that community is generating enormous economic value that is currently uncompensated. If some portion of that value were captured and transferred to the community through government payments, carbon credits, water user fees, or other mechanisms, it would provide both an income stream and an economic incentive for continued stewardship. Applied specifically to snow leopard conservation, payments for ecosystem services could work in several ways. Governments of downstream countries or regions that benefit from healthy mountain watersheds could make payments to upland communities that protect those watersheds. International carbon markets could compensate communities for maintaining carbon stocks in high-altitude vegetation. Visitor fees collected from wildlife tourists could flow directly to communities whose conservation practices support the wildlife populations that attract those tourists. Each of these mechanisms faces practical challenges: monitoring, verification, governance, equitable distribution of benefits, but in various forms, they are already being piloted in different parts of the snow leopard's range, with results that are encouraging enough to justify continued investment and scaling. The Spiti Valley of Himachal Pradesh, India, has become one of the most closely watched test cases for this suite of approaches. The valley lies at the eastern end of Himachal Pradesh, bordering Tibet, and is one of the most arid and remote inhabited valleys in the Indian Himalayas. Elevations range from about 3,000 to over 6,000 meters. The population consists of a few thousand people, mostly Tibetan Buddhist farmers and pastoralists, living in villages separated by vast stretches of high-altitude desert. The snow leopard population in and around the valley is one of the most studied in the world, thanks to decades of research by the Nature Conservation Foundation and their local partners. In the early years of conservation work in Spiti, the picture was familiar: significant livestock predation by snow leopards, retaliatory killing, negative community attitudes toward the predator, and essentially no economic benefit flowing to communities from the presence of the species. Over 20 years of sustained engagement, combining compensation mechanisms for livestock losses, community-based wildlife monitoring programs that employ local people as paid field assistants, and the development of a wildlife tourism economy that channels visitor spending to local guest houses and guides, the situation has been transformed. Retaliatory killing is now rare. Community members who were previously hostile to conservation are now advocates for it because the economic arithmetic has changed. The transformation in Spiti is not simply the result of economic incentives working mechanically on rational actors. It reflects something more subtle and important: a shift in the identity and self-understanding of the community from people who endure the snow leopard to people who are its guardians. This identity shift has been deliberately cultivated by conservation programs that foreground community ownership of the conservation enterprise, that frame the snow leopard not as an asset belonging to the state or to international conservation organizations, but as a community resource whose stewardship is both a responsibility and a source of pride. This kind of identity-based motivation for conservation behavior is more durable than economic incentive alone. because it does not depend on the continuous flow of external payments to sustain the behavior. Across the border in Nepal, the Dolpo region, one of the most remote and least visited areas of the country, presents both extraordinary conservation significance and extraordinary governance challenges. Dolpo lies in the rain shadow of the Himalayan main range, receiving very little monsoon precipitation, and its landscape of arid mountain valleys and high passes supports some of the highest concentrations of snow leopards documented anywhere in the species range. It is also the setting of Peter Mathiessen's celebrated book, The Snow Leopard, published in 1978, which brought the species to the attention of a global literary readership and established the animal as a cultural icon in the Western imagination long before scientific research had generated detailed knowledge of its ecology. The conservation challenges in Dolpo are formidable. The area is protected within Shey Phoksundo National Park, Nepal's largest national park, but enforcement capacity within the park is limited. Communities in the area are highly dependent on pastoralism, yak and sheep herding, which brings them into regular conflict with snow leopards. Access to alternative income sources is limited by the region's extreme remoteness and the small number of trekking tourists who visit each year, and the political complexity of managing a protected area that encompasses indigenous Tibetan communities with their own governance traditions, land tenure systems, and relationships with the natural world requires conservation approaches that are sensitive to this context in ways that externally designed programs often fail to achieve. Nevertheless, progress has been made. Community-based monitoring programs have generated valuable data on snow leopard populations and movements. Local conservation committees have taken on roles in wildlife protection and conflict mediation that previously fell entirely to the National Park Administration, and the slow growth of high-value, low-impact trekking tourism, visitors attracted specifically by the landscape, culture, and wildlife of the region, is beginning to create economic stakes in conservation among community members who previously had none. In Pakistan, the situation is complicated by the political fragility of the state and the insecurity that affects many of the regions where snow leopards live. Gilgit-Baltistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the administrative regions that encompass most of Pakistan's snow leopard habitat, have experienced significant political instability and security challenges that have periodically disrupted conservation programs and prevented field research. Despite this, organizations including the Snow Leopard Foundation Pakistan, WWF Pakistan, and international partners have maintained conservation programs in the region for decades, documenting snow leopard populations, working with communities to reduce human-wildlife conflict, and advocating for habitat protection within the national policy framework. One particular success story from Pakistan, the recovery of the markhor, the magnificent spiral-horned wild goat that is both national symbol and key prey species for the snow leopard, offers a model of conservation incentive design that has broader implications. In the Torghar area of Balochistan and in parts of the Chitral Valley, community-based hunting programs have been established in which a small number of trophy hunting licenses are issued each year to foreign hunters willing to pay substantial sums for the opportunity. The revenue from these licenses flows directly to local communities, which have in response become active protectors of the markhor populations that their income depends upon. Markhor populations in these areas have recovered substantially from their low points in the 1980s and 1990s. And as markhor populations have recovered, snow leopard populations in the same areas appear to have responded positively, a reminder that the predator and its prey are linked in ways that make prey recovery programs an indirect but important tool for predator conservation. The question of trophy hunting as a conservation tool is one that generates significant controversy, particularly among audiences in wealthy countries where the moral dimension of killing wildlife for recreation is viewed differently than in communities where wildlife can represent either a threat or an economic opportunity. This controversy is real and deserves honest acknowledgement. There are legitimate arguments both for and against regulated trophy hunting as a conservation mechanism, and the evidence on its net effects on wildlife populations, on habitat conservation, on community welfare, and on the broader political economy of conservation is mixed and context dependent. What the Pakistani Markhor case demonstrates is not that trophy hunting is universally beneficial, but that in specific contexts, revenue from regulated hunting can generate conservation outcomes that alternative mechanisms have not achieved, whether those outcomes could be achieved through alternative approaches. High-value photographic tourism, payments for ecosystem services, other mechanisms is a question that deserves rigorous empirical investigation rather than ideological dismissal in either direction. The science of studying snow leopards in the field is, by any measure, one of the most demanding pursuits in wildlife biology. It requires months of fieldwork at extreme altitude, in temperatures that routinely fall below -20 degrees Celsius, across terrain that would challenge experienced mountaineers even without the additional burden of scientific equipment. It demands patience of a kind that most people find difficult to sustain. Weeks and months of deploying cameras, checking cameras, finding nothing, redeploying cameras, waiting. Again, it requires physical fitness, cultural sensitivity, language skills, logistical creativity, and a tolerance for uncertainty that is not always comfortable for scientists trained to expect clean data and clear results. And yet the people who do this work describe it, almost universally, as among the most profound experiences of their professional lives. There is something about the combination of the landscape, the animal, and the difficulty of the pursuit that produces, in the people dedicated to it, a quality of attention and engagement that is rare in any field of human endeavor. The researchers who have spent years working in snow leopard habitat, people like George Schaller, who conducted some of the first systematic field surveys of the species in the 1970s, or Rodney Jackson, whose long-term work in Nepal produced foundational understanding of snow leopard ecology, or the numerous younger scientists who have built on their work, describe the mountains and the animal with a reverence that goes beyond professional commitment. It is something more like devotion. George Schaller's contributions to snow leopard science deserve particular acknowledgement because they represent one of the most remarkable careers in the history of wildlife biology. Schaller, who conducted his first surveys of snow leopards in the 1970s while working for the New York Zoological Society, approached the species at a time when almost nothing was known about its behavior, ecology, or population status in the wild. Working in conditions of extreme difficulty, with minimal technology by modern standards, no GPS, no satellite collars, no camera traps, he produced detailed observations of snow leopard sign, habitat use, and prey selection that established the scientific baseline for everything that followed. His ability to move through high-altitude terrain, read animal sign, and draw valid scientific conclusions from limited direct observation was extraordinary. His book about that period of fieldwork, written with the naturalist Peter Matthiessen, introduced the snow leopard to a global audience and arguably did more to establish the species as a conservation priority than any subsequent scientific publication. Rodney Jackson's long-term research in the Langu Valley of Nepal, conducted through the 1980s and continuing in various forms through subsequent decades, produced the first systematic data on snow leopard home range sizes, movement patterns, and individual behavior using radio telemetry. The challenges of that work are difficult to overstate. Fitting radio collars to wild snow leopards required live capture using cage traps and padded leg hold traps, followed by chemical immobilization, a procedure that carries risk to both the animal and the researcher in terrain that made any kind of emergency response essentially impossible. The data that emerged from this work fundamentally changed scientific understanding of how much space individual snow leopards require and how they use it, and it provided the first empirical basis for conservation planning at the landscape scale. The transition to GPS satellite collaring, which began in the late 1990s and became standard practice in snow leopard research over the following decade, represented a quantum leap in the quality and quantity of movement data available. Where radio telemetry provided location data only when a researcher with a receiver was within range of the collared animal, which, in remote mountain terrain, might be a few times per week at best, GPS collars communicate the animal's location to satellites on a programmed schedule, providing location fixes every few hours, regardless of the researcher's proximity. Over a year-long collar deployment, this produces thousands of locations per individual, enabling the reconstruction of detailed movement paths, identification of frequently used areas, documentation of seasonal range shifts, and analysis of habitat selection at a spatial resolution that was simply impossible with earlier technology. The data from GPS-collared snow leopards have repeatedly produced surprises. Movement rates are often considerably higher than earlier estimates suggested. Individuals regularly covering 15 to 20 kilometers per night across rugged terrain, apparently without effort. The three-dimensional complexity of movement paths, up and down through thousands of meters of elevation change in a single night, reveals a use of the vertical dimension of the landscape that flat map representations of home ranges entirely fail to capture. Encounters between neighboring individuals, documented by the simultaneous location data from multiple collared animals, reveal patterns of spatial interaction that suggest a sophisticated awareness of conspecifics locations and a behavioral avoidance system that prevents costly confrontations without requiring direct communication. One of the most illuminating findings from GPS collar research has been the documentation of snow leopard movements through what researchers call matrix habitat, the terrain between core use areas that animals traverse during long-distance movements. These movement corridors, which often cross high mountain passes, traverse valleys with human settlements, and in some cases cross international borders, are critical for maintaining genetic connectivity between subpopulations. They are also precisely the terrain most vulnerable to disruption by infrastructure development. A road built through a mountain pass that happens to be a key movement corridor for snow leopards can functionally sever the genetic connection between populations on either side, even if the road itself physically destroys very little habitat. Understanding where these corridors are, which requires the GPS movement data that only collar studies can provide, is therefore a conservation priority of the highest order. The development of non-invasive genetic sampling techniques has added a powerful new tool to the researcher's toolkit, one that avoids entirely the risks and logistical challenges of live capture while providing information that was previously obtainable only from direct tissue sampling of captured animals. Snow leopard scat, feces deposited at conspicuous locations throughout the range, contains epithelial cells shed from the intestinal lining from which DNA can be extracted and analyzed. The DNA from scat can identify the species that produced it, distinguishing snow leopard scat from that of wolves, foxes, and other carnivores. It can identify the individual that produced it, allowing researchers to track the movements and territory use of specific individuals without ever seeing them. It can determine the individual's sex, and it can characterize the genetic variation of the individual, and when data from many individuals are combined, the genetic structure of entire populations. The logistics of scat-based genetic sampling are significantly more accessible than those of live capture and collaring. Trained field teams working systematically along snow leopard travel routes. Cliffs, the rocky shoulders of valleys where scent marking and scat deposition are concentrated, can collect hundreds of samples per field season. The samples are preserved in a silica gel or ethanol solution and shipped to a laboratory for analysis. The resulting data set, the genetic identities of potentially dozens or hundreds of individuals distributed across a landscape, provides information about population size, genetic diversity, movement patterns, and the degree of connectivity between areas that took years to obtain through traditional methods. In combination with camera trap data, scat-based genetics is transforming the speed and efficiency with which population assessments can be conducted across the snow leopard's vast range. Camera trap technology itself has advanced dramatically since the first generation of infrared-triggered cameras were deployed in snow leopard habitat in the 1990s. Modern camera traps are smaller, more reliable, more weatherproof, capable of capturing high-definition video as well as still images, and equipped with wireless transmission capabilities that can send images to remote servers in near real time, eliminating the need for frequent physical visits to camera sites to retrieve data cards. The deployment of large camera trap arrays, sometimes hundreds of cameras across landscapes of thousands of square kilometers, has become feasible in a way that was unimaginable to earlier researchers. The data generated by these large-scale camera trap deployments require new approaches to analysis, individual identification of snow leopards from photographs, the process of matching spot patterns between images to determine whether two photographs show the same individual was originally done manually by researchers comparing images side by side. For small data sets, this was manageable. For data sets containing thousands of images of potentially dozens of individuals, it became impossible without computational assistance. The development of artificial intelligence tools specifically designed for individual animal identification, drawing on computer vision techniques originally developed for human facial recognition, has made large-scale camera trap analysis feasible. These tools can process thousands of images, identify probable individuals, and estimate population sizes in hours rather than the weeks or months that manual analysis required. The integration of all these data streams, GPS collar movements, genetic data from scat samples, individual identifications from camera traps, prey surveys, habitat mapping from satellite remote sensing, within sophisticated quantitative models, is producing what might be called a systems-level understanding of snow leopard ecology, not just descriptions of individual behaviors or local population sizes, but an understanding of how the entire system, predator, prey, habitat, human communities, climate, functions as an integrated whole, and how changes in any component propagate through the system to affect all others. This systems understanding is being translated into spatially explicit conservation planning tools that allow conservationists and policymakers to evaluate the likely consequences of different management decisions before implementing them, Where should a new protected area be established to maximize its benefit for the snow leopard population? Which proposed road should be opposed or modified to minimize disruption to movement corridors? Which communities should be prioritized for livestock insurance or wildlife tourism development programs? What combination of local interventions would, in combination, produce a viable long-term population across a given landscape? These are questions that can now be addressed with a rigor that was unavailable a generation ago, thanks to the combination of better data and better analytical tools. The institutions that have driven this scientific progress deserve recognition because they represent models of effective conservation science that have implications beyond the snow leopard itself. The Snow Leopard Trust, founded in 1981 and headquartered in Seattle, has pioneered community-based conservation programs across multiple range countries and maintained long-term research programs that have produced some of the most important scientific contributions to the field. WWF snow leopard programs, operating in multiple range countries, have combined scientific research with policy advocacy and community engagement at a scale that no smaller organization could achieve. The Wildlife Conservation Society has contributed foundational ecological research and has built institutional capacity in range countries by training local scientists who are now leading their own research programs. Panthera, an organization focused specifically on wildcat conservation globally, has brought sophisticated population genetics and landscape ecology expertise to bear on snow leopard questions. And a growing number of national organizations in range countries, the Snow Leopard Foundation of Pakistan, the Snow Leopard Conservation Foundation of Mongolia, the Nature Conservation Foundation of India, and others, have built the local expertise and institutional capacity to conduct and sustain conservation work without dependence on international organizations. This development of strong national and local conservation institutions is perhaps the most important long-term trend in snow leopard conservation because it addresses one of the fundamental vulnerabilities of conservation programs dependent on external funding and expertise. The risk that when international interest wanes or funding cycles end, the programs collapse and their achievements are lost. Conservation that is owned and operated by people whose homes and communities are in the landscape being protected has a durability and a legitimacy that externally driven programs, however well-intentioned, cannot easily replicate. The training and mentorship of young scientists from range countries, providing them with skills in ecological field methods, statistical analysis, GPS collar deployment, genetic sampling, camera trap methodology, and conservation planning has been a priority of several international organizations, and the results are visible in a rapidly growing body of scientific literature produced by Asian researchers on Asian snow leopard populations. Mongolian scientists are producing detailed analyses of snow leopard ecology on the Mongolian steppe. Pakistani researchers are documenting the distribution and status of snow leopards in landscapes that international researchers rarely visit for security reasons. Indian scientists are applying sophisticated statistical methods to camera trap data sets that their own field teams collected. Chinese researchers, drawing on the vast resources of Chinese scientific institutions and the extraordinary scale of China's high-altitude protected areas, are contributing population genetics data and movement ecology analyses that are filling critical gaps in the global picture. This scientific capacity building is not simply about producing publications. It is about creating the human infrastructure, the community of knowledgeable, skilled, motivated people that is a prerequisite for sustained and effective conservation effort. Laws can be passed and protected areas established and funding committed, but if there are not enough people with the knowledge and commitment to translate these inputs into effective action on the ground, the outcomes will be disappointing. The investment in training and mentorship is an investment in the most fundamental resource of conservation: informed human attention applied consistently over time to the problems that matter. The snow leopard's cultural resonance, the ways in which it has been incorporated into the symbolic and artistic life of the peoples who share its range, is a dimension of the conservation story that deserves serious attention rather than dismissal as mere sentiment. Culture shapes behavior, including the behavior of communities toward wildlife, where cultural traditions regard the snow leopard as sacred, dangerous, valuable, or emblematic. Those traditions influence how community members respond to the animal's presence, whether they protect it or persecute it, whether they take pride in its association with their landscape or resent the costs it imposes. Understanding and working with these cultural frameworks, rather than ignoring them or replacing them with externally generated conservation values, is essential for conservation programs that aspire to long-term sustainability. In Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, the snow leopard, irbis, is a national symbol, appearing on currency, official seals, and the names of sports teams and commercial enterprises. This symbolic status creates a cultural backdrop for conservation that is broadly supportive, even in the absence of specific conservation programs. When considering whether to invest in snow leopard conservation, are working within a cultural context in which the species is generally viewed positively, an advantage that conservation advocates in some other range countries do not enjoy. Whether this symbolic appreciation translates into effective conservation action is a separate question, and the answer in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan is mixed. Significant habitat degradation and illegal hunting have continued despite the cultural reverence, but the cultural foundation provides a basis for advocacy that is worth building on. In Bhutan, where the government's commitment to environmental conservation is enshrined in the national constitution and the philosophy of gross national happiness, provides an explicit framework for valuing non-economic dimensions of societal well-being, the snow leopard benefits from an institutional environment that is unusually favorable for conservation. The country's network of protected areas covers more than 50% of its territory, and movement corridors connecting protected areas are mandated by national policy. Bhutan's snow leopard population, while relatively small due to the limited area of suitable high-altitude habitat, is among the most legally protected in the entire range. The challenge in Bhutan is not political will at the national level, but the capacity and resources to enforce protections in remote areas and to manage the human-wildlife conflict that inevitably arises in buffer zones adjacent to protected areas. Afghanistan presents perhaps the most challenging conservation context in the entire range. Decades of conflict have severely disrupted the institutional infrastructure for wildlife management, eliminated the capacity for systematic field surveys, and created conditions in which subsistence hunting and the illegal wildlife trade have flourished largely unchecked. The snow leopard populations of Afghanistan's Hindu Kush and Wakhan corridor, areas that in historical surveys showed reasonable densities, have not been systematically assessed for years. Anecdotal information suggests significant decline. Conservation organizations operating in Afghanistan, working under conditions of extreme insecurity, have attempted to maintain community-based monitoring and protection programs, but their reach is necessarily limited by the security environment. The eventual stabilization of Afghanistan's political situation, whenever that comes, will require a rapid reassessment of the status of snow leopards and other wildlife and a determined effort to rebuild the conservation infrastructure that conflict has destroyed. Russia's snow leopard population, concentrated in the mountains of southern Siberia, the Altai Republic, Tuva and Buryatia, is small, estimated at perhaps 60 to 90 individuals, and is isolated from the larger populations further south by a combination of geography and habitat fragmentation. Nevertheless, it receives significant attention from Russian conservation organizations and from the national government, partly because of the species' cultural significance in the Altai region, where indigenous Turkic peoples regard the snow leopard as a totemic animal of great spiritual importance, and partly because the Russian government has used snow leopard conservation as a vehicle for demonstrating environmental credentials on the international stage. The transboundary nature of snow leopard conservation, the fact that the species crosses political borders that have no ecological meaning, creates both challenges and opportunities that are unique to this particular geographic context. Mountain ranges do not respect national sovereignty. A snow leopard born in India may establish a territory in China. An animal collared in Mongolia may be photographed in Russia. The populations of adjacent countries are, in many cases, genuinely continuous across borders, and management decisions made on one side of a border affect animals and ecosystems on the other side. The challenges are obvious. Different national laws, different levels of enforcement capacity, different political priorities, different conservation institutions, different cultural contexts, and in some cases, active political tensions between adjacent countries that make bilateral conservation cooperation difficult to sustain. The India-China border region, which encompasses some of the most important snow leopard habitat in the species range, is an area of active territorial dispute where the political climate does not facilitate the kind of collaborative science and management that the shared wildlife populations require. The borders of some Central Asian range states are marked by physical infrastructure, fences, walls, heavily monitored crossings that presents literal barriers to wildlife movement. The opportunities lie in the possibility of transboundary protected areas, conservation areas that span national boundaries and are managed cooperatively by adjacent governments and in the framework provided by the GSLEP program for international coordination on common conservation goals. Several transboundary conservation initiatives involving snow leopard habitat have been established or proposed, including areas connecting protected areas in China and Nepal, in Russia and Mongolia, and in Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and the Pamir region. Progress on these initiatives has been slow and uneven, but the concept is sound and the precedents established by successful transboundary conservation efforts in other parts of the world. The Greater Virunga landscape spanning Rwanda, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Kavango-Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area in southern Africa, demonstrate that it is achievable even in politically complex contexts. The long view of snow leopard conservation, looking back at where the species stood 50 years ago and forward to where it might be 50 years from now, requires a careful balancing of realism and hope that resists both easy optimism and unnecessary despair. The realism must acknowledge that the threats are real and serious, that the species has experienced significant population decline from historical levels, that climate change represents a challenge of a fundamentally different character from the direct threats of hunting and habitat loss that traditional conservation measures are designed to address. The hope must be grounded not in wishful thinking, but in the genuine progress that conservation effort has achieved. The communities that have transformed their relationship with the snow leopard, the populations that have stabilized or recovered, the scientific knowledge that has expanded from almost nothing to a sophisticated systems understanding, the institutional capacity that has been built in range countries. The next 50 years will test the durability of these achievements against pressures that will be intense and in some cases unprecedented. Climate change will continue to reshape high-altitude ecosystems regardless of what conservation programs do in the mountains. Economic development in range countries, which is legitimate and necessary for the hundreds of millions of people who live there in poverty, will bring infrastructure and land use changes that create new pressures on snow leopard habitat. Political instability in some range countries will periodically disrupt conservation programs, and the global demand for the products of the illegal wildlife trade will persist as long as affluence creates markets that poverty creates suppliers for. Against these pressures, the conservation response must be more sophisticated, better resourced, more politically connected, and more deeply embedded in local communities than it has been in the past. The scientific tools are available. The conceptual framework, landscape scale, community-centered, ecologically grounded, is sound. The institutional infrastructure, while still incomplete in some range countries, is more developed than it has ever been. What is required now is the sustained commitment to deploy these resources effectively over the timescales that conservation of long-lived, wide-ranging animals requires. Not years, but decades. Not project cycles, but generational commitments. There are moments in the field, reported by researchers who have worked in snow leopard habitat for years, that crystallize the entire enterprise in a way that no amount of data or policy analysis can replicate. A researcher sitting on a ridge at dawn, cold beyond comfort, having spent weeks finding only tracks and scrapes and the occasional distant glimpse of something pale moving between rocks, and then, suddenly, a snow leopard, not at the distance of a camera trap image, not identified by spot pattern in a photograph, present, real, unhurried, indifferent to the observer's existence, crossing a snowfield below the ridge with that characteristic fluid movement that looks casual until you realize the speed it conceals. Pausing to look back once with pale eyes that register everything and conceal everything, and then continuing over the ridge and out of sight. These moments are rare. They cannot be manufactured or scheduled or guaranteed. They are the product of patience, preparation, and the willingness to sit with uncertainty for as long as it takes. They are, in a sense, a gift from an animal that owes us nothing and gives us nothing deliberately. And they are, for the people who experience them, profoundly and permanently significant, not because they are beautiful, though they are beautiful, but because they are evidence of something real and vital and irreplaceable continuing to exist in a world that is pushing hard against its continued existence. The snow leopard does not perform for its audience. It does not know that it is observed or studied or celebrated or feared. It does not know that its image is used in conservation fundraising campaigns, or that its name has become a metaphor for elusiveness in a dozen languages, or that thousands of people across the world regard its survival as a matter of moral consequence. It simply continues, as it has always continued, moving through the mountains on paths laid down by generations of its kind, following prey, marking territory, raising young in rock crevices above the clouds, living the life that millions of years of evolution have equipped it to live. That life is not guaranteed. Nothing biological is guaranteed, but it is still possible. The ghost is still walking these mountains, and as long as it is, the story is not over. The ending is still unwritten. That is, perhaps, the most important thing to hold on to. Not the threats, not the statistics, not the policy failures and conservation shortfalls, but the simple, stubborn, magnificent fact that the animal is still there, still hunting, still denning, still raising cubs, still moving across the snow in the darkness before dawn, leaving prints that will be covered by the next snowfall and found again by the next researcher who climbs to this ridge, this ledge, this particular fold in the mountain where the world is very old and very cold and very wild, and where something extraordinary is still alive. The particular quality of the snow leopard's persistence, its continued existence in landscapes that have experienced dramatic human modification, its ability to maintain populations in areas where other large predators have long since been extirpated, its apparent capacity to absorb significant levels of disturbance and still survive, speaks to a resilience that is real and should not be underestimated. This animal has been hunted, its habitat degraded, its prey depleted, its populations fragmented, and it is still here. It has survived all of recorded human history in these mountains, through the rise and fall of empires, through the invention of firearms, through the transformation of its human neighbors from subsistence herders to participants in a global economy. That persistence is not an accident. It reflects genuine biological flexibility, an ability to adjust behavior, range use, prey selection, and activity patterns in response to changing conditions that is characteristic of cognitively sophisticated predators. This flexibility should give conservationists genuine hope, but it should not encourage complacency. The resilience of the snow leopard has limits, and those limits are being tested in ways and at rates that have no precedent in the species' evolutionary history. The combined pressure of habitat loss, prey depletion, direct persecution, and climate change is qualitatively different from anything the species has faced before, not because any single one of these threats is necessarily beyond the snow leopard's adaptive capacity, but because all of them are occurring simultaneously, reinforcing each other at a global scale and at a pace that evolutionary adaptation cannot match. The question is not whether the snow leopard can survive any individual threat. The question is whether it can survive all of them together, in combination without the kind of deliberate human assistance that conservation programs are designed to provide. The answer to that question will be determined not by the snow leopard's biology, but by human choices. Choices made in national capitals, in international organizations, in mountain communities, in consumer markets, in academic institutions, in conservation organizations, and by individuals who decide whether or not to care about what happens to an animal most of them will never see, in mountains most of them will never visit, in ecosystems whose importance to their own lives is real but invisible. These choices are being made now every day by people who may not realize that they are making them. The direction in which those choices collectively push will determine what the snow leopard's future looks like. There is a valley in the Wakhan corridor of northeastern Afghanistan where the Pamir and Hindu Kush ranges converge, where the elevation is so extreme and the air so thin that trees cannot grow, and the only vegetation is a sparse scrub of drought-resistant shrubs clinging to rocky slopes above wide, braided rivers of glacial meltwater. The Waki people who have herded animals in this valley for centuries live in stone houses with earthen roofs, burn dung for fuel, and measure the seasons by the movement of their flocks between summer pastures high in the mountains and winter settlements in the valley floor. They have shared this landscape with snow leopards for as long as their oral history extends. They have stories about the animal that predate any written record. They know its habits with an intimacy that no field researcher, however skilled, can fully replicate. Ask a Waki elder about the snow leopard, and you will hear something more layered than the simple hostility and conflict narrative that dominates outside reporting on human-wildlife relationships in this region. You will hear acknowledgement that the animal kills livestock and that this is a serious hardship. But you will also hear something that sounds, in translation, like respect, recognition of the animal's qualities, its power, its intelligence, its mastery of terrain that challenges even experienced human herders. You will hear stories that treat the snow leopard not as a pest to be eliminated, but as a force of nature to be negotiated with, like weather or altitude, a permanent presence in the landscape whose behavior must be understood and planned for rather than simply opposed. This is not romanticism about indigenous relationships with nature, a category into which outside observers too easily collapse complex and varied human attitudes toward wildlife. The Waki are not uniformly positive about snow leopards. There are individuals who have lost animals they could not afford to lose and whose response is straightforwardly hostile. There are economic pressures that push people toward choices. Expanded livestock herds, use of marginal high-altitude pastures that increase conflict. There are generational differences in attitude, with younger people who have had more exposure to market economies and urban influences showing different relationships to both the land and its wildlife than their elders. But there is also, in many communities across the snow leopard's range, a reservoir of traditional ecological knowledge about the animal, its movement patterns, denning habits, hunting behavior, seasonal range shifts, that has been accumulated over generations of close observation and that represents a scientific resource of genuine value. Ethnobiological research that takes this knowledge seriously, documents it rigorously, and integrates it with data from formal scientific surveys, produces richer and more comprehensive pictures of snow leopard ecology than either source could provide alone. The routes that traditional herders identify as places where snow leopards are frequently seen, the seasonal patterns they describe in the animal's movements, the prey species they report being taken in different seasons. All of this constitutes data, imperfect and anecdotal by strict scientific standards, but valuable for generating hypotheses, guiding camera trap placement, and providing historical context that recent scientific monitoring cannot supply. The integration of traditional ecological knowledge into formal conservation science and the snow leopard's range provides some of the most instructive examples of both how to do it well and how not to do it. Programs that engage community members as genuine research partners, training them in systematic observation protocols, compensating them fairly for their time, incorporating their knowledge into research designs from the beginning rather than extracting it as an afterthought, consistently produce better outcomes, both scientifically and in terms of community relationships, than programs that use communities instrumentally without genuine respect for their knowledge and agency. The contrast between this collaborative model and the older top-down conservation paradigm in which outside experts arrived with predetermined answers and asked local people to adjust their behavior accordingly, is stark, and the evidence for the superiority of the collaborative approach is now substantial enough to have shifted the consensus in conservation science. The shift has not been universal or complete. There are still conservation programs operating in snow leopard habitat that treat local communities primarily as threats to be managed rather than partners to be engaged. But these programs are increasingly recognized as both ethically problematic and practically ineffective, and the field is moving away from them. The economic dimensions of snow leopard conservation, the costs that conservation imposes on local communities, and the benefits that communities receive or could receive from conservation have been subjected to increasingly rigorous analysis over the past decade, and the results are illuminating in ways that both support and complicate standard conservation narratives. The estimates of livestock predation losses attributable to snow leopards in different parts of the range vary widely, but where rigorous data are available, they consistently show that the losses are significant relative to household incomes. In some areas, a single snow leopard attack on a livestock corral can destroy the equivalent of weeks or months of a family's income. Across an entire community, annual predation losses can represent a meaningful fraction of total livestock value. On the benefit side, the analysis of economic returns from wildlife tourism associated with snow leopards shows that where tourism infrastructure exists and tourist numbers are sufficient, the economic value generated can exceed the cost of livestock losses by substantial margins. The key words here are where tourism infrastructure exists and tourist numbers are sufficient. Two conditions that are not met across most of the snow leopard's range. The Spiti Valley and a handful of other locations in Nepal, India, and Bhutan have successfully developed wildlife tourism markets for the snow leopard. Across the vast majority of the species range, remote valleys in Tajikistan, high plateaus in China, mountain regions of Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, wildlife tourism infrastructure barely exists. Tourist numbers are negligible, and the economic case for conservation built on tourism revenue simply cannot be made in any honest way to the communities who bear the costs of living with the predator. This is an honest assessment that conservation advocates sometimes resist because it complicates the narrative they wish to tell. If the economic case for snow leopard conservation depends on tourism, and tourism only works in a small fraction of the range, then for the majority of communities in the range, the conservation argument must rest on something other than economic self-interest. It must rest on some combination of cultural values, spiritual significance, legal obligation, payments that come from outside the community, from governments or international organizations, and a conception of global common interest in biodiversity conservation that may or may not resonate with communities dealing with immediate economic hardship. This is not an argument against conservation. It is an argument for honesty about what conservation requires. If communities in most of the snow leopard's range are not going to benefit economically from wildlife tourism, and if conservation is nevertheless in the global interest, then the global community bears a responsibility to provide the resources, financial, technical, institutional, that make conservation feasible for those communities without imposing uncompensated costs on people who are already among the world's most economically marginal. The political and moral logic of this responsibility is clear. Whether the international community will act on it with the sustained commitment that the situation demands is a question that remains, as of now, unanswered. The specific mechanisms by which international resources can be transferred to mountain communities in support of conservation includes several that are already operational in parts of the snow leopard's range, and that could be expanded significantly. REDD+, the UN framework for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, provides a mechanism for compensating communities in developing countries for maintaining forest carbon stocks. While high-altitude snow leopard habitat is not primarily forested, analogs to REDD+ for grassland and alpine ecosystems are under development, and some pilot programs are already testing approaches that could generate carbon finance for communities that maintain intact mountain ecosystems. Biodiversity offset mechanisms in which developers whose projects impact biodiversity in one location are required to fund conservation elsewhere to compensate for those impacts could channel significant resources to mountain conservation if adequately designed and enforced. Mining companies and infrastructure developers operating in adjacent lowland areas whose activities benefit from the water regulation services provided by intact mountain watersheds have a direct economic interest in maintaining those watersheds, an interest that could, in principle, be converted into financial contributions to mountain conservation through appropriate regulatory frameworks. International conservation funds, the Global Environment Facility, the Global Conservation Fund, the various bilateral conservation aid programs of wealthy nations provide grants that support conservation programs in range countries, but the amounts available fall far short of what a genuinely comprehensive conservation response would require. Increasing the flow of international public finance to mountain conservation will require sustained advocacy directed at the governments and international institutions that control these funds, making the case as compellingly as the science supports that investment in snow leopard habitat is investment in global ecosystem services, climate resilience, and biodiversity conservation that benefits the whole world. The argument for this investment is strengthened by the growing recognition of the Himalayas and adjacent mountain systems as what climatologists and hydrologists call the third pole, a reference to the fact that these mountain ranges contain the largest concentration of ice and snow outside the Arctic and Antarctic, and that the water stored in this ice and snow is as critical to regional climate and water security as the polar ice caps are to global climate regulation. The third pole concept frames the conservation of mountain ecosystems not as a narrow wildlife issue, but as a global climate and water security issue of the first order, a framing that is potentially more effective in mobilizing the political attention and financial resources that conservation requires. The health of third pole ecosystems, their ability to retain water, regulate flow, maintain soil stability, and support the biodiversity that drives ecological processes is directly affected by the integrity of the predator-prey relationships at the top of the food chain. Healthy snow leopard populations regulate ungulate behavior in ways that prevent overgrazing of alpine vegetation, maintaining the soil and plant communities that hold water and prevent erosion. Degraded predator populations allow ungulate populations to grow unchecked, potentially leading to overgrazing, soil degradation, increased runoff, and reduced water quality in the rivers that flow from these mountains to the populated lowlands. This is the ecological logic that links snow leopard conservation to water security for hundreds of millions of people, a logic that, properly communicated, has the potential to mobilize constituencies for mountain conservation far beyond the traditional wildlife conservation community. The communication of conservation science to public audiences, the translation of technical findings into narratives that engage non-specialist attention and motivate conservation-supporting behavior, has itself become a subject of serious study with insights that are relevant to how the snow leopard's story is told. Research in science communication and conservation psychology has identified several principles that consistently influence whether people engage with conservation messages and whether engagement translates into action. Concrete and specific stories about individual animals are more engaging than abstract statistics about species-level trends. Positive framing, emphasizing what can be saved rather than what has been lost, is more motivating than doom-laden narratives. Messages that connect conservation outcomes to human well-being generate broader audiences than those framed purely in terms of wildlife value. And trust in the messenger is critical. Messages from sources perceived as credible, honest, and not commercially motivated are more effective than those from sources perceived as having agenda or institutional interest. Wildlife documentary filmmaking, at its best, applies these principles intuitively. The image of a snow leopard crossing a moonlit snowfield, or a mother leading cubs down a cliff face in the early morning light, or a predator and prey locked in the explosive geometry of a hunt. These images communicate something about the snow leopard that pages of scientific text cannot. They create an emotional relationship between the viewer and the animal that is the foundation of conservation motivation. The best wildlife documentaries, those that combine stunning imagery with honest, scientifically grounded narration that neither sensationalizes nor sanitizes the realities of wild animal life, have demonstrably influenced public attitudes toward conservation and have generated support for specific conservation programs. The BBC's Natural History Unit, National Geographic, the IMAX film format, and a growing number of independent filmmakers have all contributed to a body of snow leopard film documentation that has grown substantially over the past decade, as camera technology advances have made it more feasible to obtain high-quality footage of an animal previously almost impossible to film in the wild. The BBC series Planet Earth 2, which featured an extraordinary sequence of a snow leopard hunt filmed in the Himalayas, reached an audience estimated in the hundreds of millions globally and generated a measurable spike in public interest in the species and in donations to conservation organizations working on its behalf. This is the power of well-executed wildlife filmmaking at its most evident. The ability to bring an animal that exists in remote mountains, known to almost no one directly, into the living rooms and imaginations of a global audience, creating a constituency for its conservation that could not be created by any other means. The ethics of wildlife filmmaking in this context deserve brief examination because they are not simple. Filming a snow leopard in the wild requires extended presence in its habitat, which may in some cases cause disturbance. The deployment of camera traps with infrared triggers means that the animal is subjected to invisible monitoring without consent, a consideration that seems obvious when stated but is rarely considered explicitly. The use of footage to support conservation advocacy can create incentives to present the animal's situation in ways that are emotionally compelling but not always scientifically precise. And the economic value of high quality snow leopard footage creates market incentives that can drive filmmakers toward behavior in the field that prioritizes footage quality over animal welfare. Responsible wildlife filmmakers and the organizations that work with them have developed codes of practice designed to manage these tensions, limiting time spent in sensitive habitat, using camera trapping rather than active pursuit where possible, ensuring that footage is accompanied by scientifically accurate narration, and committing a portion of revenue from wildlife productions to conservation programs in the areas where filming occurs. These practices are not universally followed, and the regulatory frameworks governing wildlife filming in different range countries vary enormously in their effectiveness, but the direction of travel is positive, and the growing professionalization of conservation filmmaking is producing standards that are more likely to protect the animals and ecosystems being depicted. Social media has added a new and complex dimension to the public communication of snow leopard conservation. Platforms including YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok have enabled conservation organizations, researchers, and community programs to share footage, data, and stories with global audiences at essentially zero marginal cost. A democratization of communication that has created new opportunities for constituency building and fundraising. Camera trap footage of snow leopards shared on social media routinely generates hundreds of thousands of views and substantial engagement, translating into donations, petition signatures, and political advocacy that conservation programs with limited traditional media budgets could not otherwise achieve. The algorithmic dynamics of social media platforms, which favor content that generates immediate emotional responses, have both positive and negative implications for conservation communication. Images and videos of snow leopards generate the kind of immediate aesthetic and emotional response, the response to beauty, to wildness, to an animal that is simultaneously powerful and graceful and profoundly other, that performs well on these platforms, which works in favor of conservation messaging. But the same dynamics favor dramatic and alarming content over nuanced and evidence-based content, which can push conservation communicators toward exaggeration of crisis and oversimplification of solutions in order to maintain algorithmic visibility. The tension between emotional impact and scientific accuracy in conservation communication is real and ongoing. Resolution of this tension requires communicators who are genuinely committed to both, who understand that the long-term credibility of conservation science depends on not overstating the evidence, and who also understand that evidence without emotional resonance will not motivate the behavior change that conservation requires. The most effective conservation communicators are those who have found ways to tell true stories compellingly, who do not need to exaggerate, because the truth, when properly told, is more than sufficient to engage, concern, and motivate. The truth about the snow leopard properly told is this: a magnificent and scientifically fascinating animal occupies one of the most extraordinary landscapes on Earth. Its biology is a product of evolutionary refinement of extraordinary refinement of extraordinary elegance. Its ecology is more complex and more important to human welfare than most people realize. Its survival is threatened by forces that are real but not insurmountable. The people who share its landscape have complicated relationships with it that are being transformed, in some places successfully, by conservation approaches that respect both the animal and the communities. The science needed to understand it is more advanced than ever before. The institutional capacity to protect it is being built, unevenly but genuinely, across its range, and the window of opportunity to secure its long-term future, while viable populations still exist in sufficient habitat across enough of its range to maintain genetic diversity and ecological function, remains open. None of this is guaranteed. Conservation success at the scale required is genuinely difficult, requiring sustained effort and resources over timescales that exceed normal human planning horizons. The forces working against it, climate change, economic development pressure, political instability, illegal trade, are powerful and persistent. But conservation success at this scale has been achieved before with other species in other landscapes by the accumulation of individual efforts and institutional commitments that seemed inadequate to the task until suddenly they were sufficient. The snow leopard has been called many things: ghost, phantom, spirit of the mountains, the most beautiful animal alive. These names speak to something real about the animal: its elusiveness, its association with landscapes that seem to belong to another world, the quality of otherworldliness that attaches to any glimpse of it. But it is also emphatically a biological reality. It eats and sleeps and breeds and struggles and dies like any other living thing. It is subject to the same laws of ecology and genetics and physiology that govern every organism. Its future will be determined not by mythology, but by ecology, economics, politics, and the choices of the human beings who share the planet with it. The mythology matters, though, not as a substitute for scientific and policy response, but as the motivational foundation on which that response must be built. Human beings do not make sustained sacrifices for things they do not care about. They do not maintain long-term commitments to conservation programs for species they regard as simply another data point in a biodiversity spreadsheet. The emotional and cultural significance of the snow leopard, the way it captures the imagination, the way it stands for something larger than itself in the minds of people who have never seen it and likely never will, is not irrelevant sentiment. It is the psychological infrastructure of conservation motivation. And it needs to be maintained and cultivated with the same care that is given to the scientific and institutional infrastructure of the conservation program itself. The mountains endure. The glaciers are retreating. The climate is changing. The ecology is shifting. But the mountains themselves, the Himalayas, the Karakoram, the Pamir, the Hindu Kush, the Altai, the Tian Shan, will persist long after the civilizations currently contesting their resources have risen and fallen. In geological time, they are young, still rising, still being shaped by the collision of tectonic plates that has been continuing for 50 million years. In human time, they are immense and ancient beyond comprehension. They will be here long after the questions we are currently wrestling with have been answered one way or another. What will be living in them is the question: whether the pale spotted predator that has haunted these ridges for millions of years will still be crossing their snowfields in the centuries ahead. Whether the tracks will still be found in the morning, the scrape marks still visible on the rocks, the camera traps still recording that fluid, purposeful passage through the mountain darkness, depends on choices being made now, in this generation, by people who have the knowledge to understand what is at stake and the capacity, if they choose to exercise it, to make the difference. The responsibility is not comfortable, but it is real, and accepting it, genuinely accepting it, not as an abstraction, but as a practical commitment to specific actions in specific places over specific timescales, is what the conservation of the snow leopard ultimately requires. Not admiration, not sympathy, not the passive appreciation of an animal encountered in a documentary or a photograph. Active, sustained, adequately resourced effort to address the specific threats that specific populations face in specific landscapes. That is what will determine the outcome. The ghost of the mountains is watching from its ledge above 5,000 meters with those pale eyes that gather what little light there is and reveal nothing of what they see. It watches the world below with the patient, undivided attention of a predator that has learned over a very long time that patience is the prerequisite of survival. It has been watching for millions of years. It asks nothing. It offers nothing except its continued existence as a fact in the world. a fact of such extraordinary beauty and ecological significance that its loss would diminish everything, including us. The question is whether we are watching back, whether we are paying enough attention with enough sustained commitment to ensure that what we see when we look at these mountains in 50 years is still the same thing we can see today. A landscape complete, a food web intact, a predator in its place at the top of it, moving through the cold and the dark and the high thin air with the grace of something that belongs here, that has always belonged here, and that if we choose rightly, always will. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only at extreme altitude. It is not the silence of a quiet room or a forest at night or a desert at midday. It is something qualitatively different, a silence so complete that it seems to have physical weight, a presence rather than an absence, as though the atmosphere itself has become still enough to be perceived as a substance. In this silence, the sounds that do exist, the creak of rock expanding in the first warmth of morning, the distant percussion of a stone loosened by ice falling down a kolar, the whisper of wind over a ridge 2 kilometers away, acquire a clarity and distinctness that seem almost unreal. Every sound is isolated in the silence the way a single star is isolated in a clear winter sky. It is in this silence that the snow leopard is most completely itself, not because silence defines it, but because the silence of the high mountains is the medium in which all of its senses operate at their fullest capacity. The sounds of prey moving across scree, the faint vibration of approaching footsteps transmitted through rock, the distant call of a bird that might betray the presence of something disturbing the landscape below. All of these signals, received in silence, are processed by a nervous system refined over millions of generations to extract maximum information from minimum input. The snow leopard's world is read in whispers. Its mastery of that world is built on an ability to hear and to understand what those whispers say. We have, over the course of this account, moved through the biology of the animal, the ecology of its hunting, the sociology of its solitude, the complexity of its relationship with human communities, the science that has been built to understand it, the conservation frameworks being developed to protect it, the threats it faces, and the grounds for hope that conservation progress provides. What remains at the end is something that resists systematic treatment, the quality of experience for those who pursue it, of simply being in the presence of the snow leopard's world, not necessarily the animal itself, which may remain invisible for weeks and months at a stretch, but the world it inhabits, the landscape shaped by the same forces that shaped the animal, the ecosystem structured by the same relationships that gave rise to the predator, the silence in which all of it exists. Researchers who have spent years in snow leopard habitat speak of this landscape with an attachment that goes beyond professional interest, the particular quality of light on a Himalayan morning when the sun clears the peaks to the east and strikes the south-facing cliffs in gold while the valley floor is still in shadow. The way a storm builds over the high passes, visible from 50 kilometers away as a wall of gray-white that advances with deliberate speed, filling the sky from horizon to horizon before the first snow crystals reach the ground where you are standing, the color of a glacial river in late afternoon. That specific shade of turquoise gray that occurs when glacial flour, the fine rock powder produced by glacial grinding, is suspended in meltwater at just the right concentration. These are not sentimental observations. They are the raw material of a relationship with place that, for the people who develop it, becomes one of the most significant dimensions of their lives. The snow leopard is inseparable from this place. You cannot understand the animal without understanding the landscape, and you cannot fully understand the landscape without understanding the animal that has been shaping it through its predation and its behavioral influence on prey for as long as both have existed there. They are each other's context. The mountain makes the cat, and the cat, in ways that are ecological rather than geological, but no less real, makes the mountain. This integration of predator and landscape is what gives the snow leopard its particular significance as a conservation symbol. And the word symbol here is not diminutive, because symbols, when they are chosen well, are not mere abstractions, but accurate representations of real and important things. The snow leopard is a symbol of the high mountain ecosystem, not because conservation advocates chose it arbitrarily from among the available charismatic megafauna, but because it genuinely represents what that ecosystem is: ancient, austere, integrated, dependent on relationships of predation and coevolution that have been running for geological timescales, and now vulnerable to disruption at rates that those timescales cannot absorb. To care about the snow leopard is to care about all of this. It is to care about the integrity of ecological relationships that have no direct economic value, but that sustain, through processes that are real, if not always visible, the conditions for human life across vast regions of Asia. It is to care about the right of other species to exist on this planet, not because they are useful to us or beautiful to us, though the snow leopard is certainly beautiful, but because they have as legitimate a claim to continued existence as we do, a claim grounded not in any legal framework, but in the simple fact that they have been here, adapting, surviving, reproducing, for far longer than we have, and that our power to eliminate them does not confer the right to do so. This is not a radical position. It is increasingly the consensus position of both conservation science and environmental ethics. The recognition that biodiversity has intrinsic value independent of human use or human preference, is embedded in the Convention on Biological Diversity, ratified by nearly every nation on Earth, and in the ethical frameworks of conservation organizations across the political spectrum. What has been missing is not the recognition of this value, but the sustained political will and financial commitment to act on it at the scale that the situation demands. The snow leopard forces this gap between recognition and action into sharp focus. Here is an animal of extraordinary intrinsic value, facing documented and serious threats in landscapes of global ecological significance, with conservation science sufficient to guide effective response, with local communities increasingly willing to be partners in conservation if adequately supported, with institutional frameworks for international cooperation in place. And yet the resources committed to its conservation remain a tiny fraction of what the scientific assessment of the problem indicates would be required for a genuinely adequate response. This is not a failure of knowledge or understanding or even of will at the individual level. It is a systemic failure of collective prioritization, in which the long-term and diffuse benefits of biodiversity conservation are consistently crowded out by the short-term and concentrated interests of economic development. Changing this systemic bias is the deepest challenge in conservation, and it cannot be solved by any single conservation program or any single scientific finding, however important. It requires a broader cultural and political shift in how societies value the natural world, a shift that is happening, driven by growing public awareness of biodiversity loss, climate change, and the ecosystem services that healthy natural systems provide, but that is happening more slowly than the rate of biodiversity loss requires. The urgency of this broader shift is something that the snow leopard situation helps to illustrate in concrete and emotionally resonant terms, which is one of the reasons why telling the animal story honestly and compellingly matters beyond the immediate constituency of wildlife conservation enthusiasts. Every person who watches a documentary about the snow leopard and feels something, curiosity, admiration, concern, the particular quality of wonder that attaches to encounters with genuine wildness, is a potential participant in the political constituency for conservation. They may never donate to a conservation organization, never sign a petition, never contact their political representative about wildlife policy, but they carry, after that encounter, a changed relationship to the natural world, a slightly broader sense of what is at stake in environmental decisions, a slightly more personal investment in the question of what happens to wild places and wild things. These changes are individually small. Cumulatively, across millions of people, they are the substrate from which conservation-supporting political will is built. This is why documentaries, books, scientific papers, communicated to general audiences, social media content, wildlife photography, and all the other forms of public engagement with the natural world matter, not because any single piece of content changes the world, but because the aggregate effect of sustained, high-quality public communication about the natural world is the cultivation of a citizenry more likely to support conservation-enabling policies, more likely to hold governments accountable for environmental commitments, more likely to make consumer choices that reduce pressure on natural systems. The snow leopard, precisely because it is so charismatic and so genuinely remarkable, is an unusually effective ambassador for this broader enterprise. Consider what it takes for a snow leopard to cross a high mountain pass in winter. The temperature is perhaps minus 30 degrees Celsius. The wind is blowing at 60 kilometers per hour, driving fine snow crystals horizontally across the exposed ridge. The visibility is reduced to perhaps 10 meters. The footing is a combination of ice, loose snow, and exposed rock, each presenting different traction challenges that must be responded to instantaneously with adjustments of weight distribution, claw engagement, and body posture. The oxygen concentration is perhaps 60% of sea level values, meaning that every physical effort costs more metabolically and recovers more slowly than it would at lower altitude. And the snow leopard is crossing this pass not as a matter of survival necessity in the immediate moment, but because its territory extends on both sides of the divide, and the prey that sustains it through the winter may be on whichever side conditions currently favor. This journey, routine for the animal, extraordinary to any human observer who tries to imagine it, is a distillation of everything that the snow leopard is. The physical capacity, the behavioral flexibility, the spatial knowledge, the sheer persistence, the willingness to engage with conditions that would defeat most other living things. To watch it, even in imagination, is to feel something like humility, the recognition that the world contains forms of excellence and adaptation that make our own capacities seem modest by comparison, that the mountain environments we visit as tourists or researchers are home territories for an animal that knows them in a biological sense with an intimacy we can only approximate. That humility is appropriate. It is also, in the context of conservation, useful. The recognition that other species have capacities and ways of being in the world that we cannot fully understand or replicate is a foundation for the ethical position that they deserve the space and conditions to continue existing It is harder to justify the elimination of something you regard with genuine respect than something you regard with indifference. The snow leopard, for anyone who has spent time learning about it, commands respect, not the sentimental anthropomorphism that projects human emotions onto animal behavior, but the genuine respect that comes from understanding what an animal has achieved over evolutionary timescales in one of the harshest environments on the planet. The individual lives of wild snow leopards, each one distinct, each one a complete narrative of birth, learning, territorial establishment, hunting, mating, perhaps reproduction, and eventual death, are the fundamental units of the species' existence. Population statistics and conservation metrics aggregate these individual lives into numbers, which is necessary for scientific analysis and policy making, but which can obscure the reality that what we are talking about in the end is individual animals living individual lives in specific places at specific times. There is a female snow leopard somewhere in the high valleys of Nepal or India or Pakistan or China that will give birth to cubs this spring. She has selected a den, a deep crack in a granite cliff above a valley where her prey animals graze through the summer. She has lined it with her own fur, pulled loose with her teeth from her belly and flanks. She will spend weeks in this den, nursing her cubs, managing their warmth, leaving only briefly to hunt when hunger becomes pressing and returning as quickly as she can. The cubs she is carrying now, perhaps 2, perhaps 3, are the next generation of a lineage that extends back through time to the first felids that colonized these mountains millions of years and thousands of generations ago. Whether those cubs will survive to independence, will establish territories, will themselves reproduce, whether the lineage will continue, depends on circumstances partly within and partly outside the control of any human conservation effort. What conservation can do is improve the odds, reduce the likelihood that the livestock predation her hunting will cause in the summer will result in a retaliatory killing, ensure that the corridor she uses to move between seasonal hunting areas is not severed by a new road, support the community monitoring program that will detect and deter any poaching attempt in her territory, maintain the prey populations that will determine whether she can raise her cubs to independence, fund the research that will track her movements and use that data to refine conservation planning for the landscape she inhabits. None of this is glamorous. Conservation is, in practice, a great deal of unglamorous work. Grant writing, community meetings, long nights, reviewing camera trap footage, statistical analysis, government advocacy, donor communication, field logistics in difficult conditions, and the management of organizational relationships across cultural and linguistic barriers. The glamour, to the extent it exists, is reserved for the rare moments of direct encounter with the animal itself, which even the most dedicated field researcher may experience only a handful of times in a career. What sustains the work between those moments is commitment to the animal, to the landscape, to the communities that share it, to the scientific questions that still need answers, to the conviction that the effort is worthwhile even when progress is slow and setbacks are frequent. The people who have dedicated their professional lives to understanding and protecting the snow leopard are, without exception, people of extraordinary commitment. They work in conditions that most professionals would find intolerable for financial rewards, at least, that are modest by any comparison, sustained by a sense of purpose that comes from working on something genuinely important and genuinely difficult. They come from many different backgrounds: ecology, conservation biology, anthropology, economics, law, filmmaking, community development, and from many different countries, including an increasing number from the range states themselves. They disagree with each other about strategy and methodology and priority in the way that people who care deeply about something always disagree. But they share a conviction that the animal is worth the effort, that the effort is making a difference, and that the difference, while not yet sufficient, is real and worth continuing and expanding. That conviction, grounded in evidence, sustained by commitment and expressed in action across 12 countries and 2 million square kilometers of some of the most extraordinary landscape on Earth, is the foundation on which the snow leopard's future will be built. It is not a guarantee. Nothing in conservation is guaranteed, but it is the best that intelligence and dedication and genuine care for the natural world can produce in the face of threats that are real, serious, and not going away on their own. The mountains are still there. The prey animals are still there. The communities are still there, negotiating their complex relationships with a predator that has been part of their world since before history. The researchers are still there, patiently accumulating the knowledge that informs better decisions. The ghost is still there, walking ridgelines at elevations where the air is thin and the silence is absolute, and the stars on clear nights above 5,000 meters are so numerous and so bright that the sky seems to lean down and touch the peaks. It is still there. That is the beginning of hope. And hope, grounded in reality, combined with action proportionate to the stakes, is what the snow leopard needs from us. Not our wonder, though wonder is appropriate. Not our admiration, though the animal earns it entirely, but our active, sustained, practically expressed commitment to ensuring that the world it inhabits remains intact enough, connected enough, and protected enough for its particular kind of excellence to continue. For its lineage, millions of years old, encoded in that pale spotted fur and those enormous round paws and that extraordinary tail, to extend forward into a future we cannot fully see, but that we, more than any other species on Earth, have the capacity to shape. The ghost of the mountains has been here since before us. With the right choices made now, in this generation, it will be here long after the particular concerns that currently occupy our attention have faded into the geological past. That is the aspiration. That is the work. That is what the silence of the high mountains, if we are quiet enough to listen to it, seems to ask of us. In the end, the snow leopard does not need our stories about it. It does not need to be a ghost, or a spirit, or a symbol, or an ambassador, or an indicator species, or a charismatic megafauna, or an ecosystem engineer. Though it is all of these things, in the vocabularies of different human ways of knowing, it needs habitat, it needs prey, it needs corridors, it needs communities that can live with it without being destroyed by the cost of doing so. It needs the absence of bullets and snares. It needs the climate to remain within the range its biology can accommodate. These are concrete, specific, achievable things, not in their entirety and not immediately, but progressively through sustained effort, through the kinds of programs and policies and commitments that this account has tried to describe. The last light of afternoon in the high mountains falls at an angle so acute that it seems to come not from above, but from the side, catching every surface at a glancing angle that makes the texture of rock and snow visible with extraordinary clarity. Every crystal, every crack, every scrape mark and footprint and depression where something heavy passed this way not long ago. In this light, the evidence of the snow leopard's passage through the landscape is legible to anyone who knows how to read it. The tracks in the snow, already half filled by wind-blown crystals, but still clear enough to follow for 20 meters before they reach bare rock. The scrape at the base of a prominent boulder, where the hind feet raked the earth and left a faint trace of glandular scent that will remain readable to another snow leopard for weeks. The tuft of gray-white fur caught in the crack of a rock face where a large animal squeezed through a gap above the cliff. The half-eaten carcass of a barrel, tucked under an overhang, covered with a loose scraping of dirt and pebbles in the snow leopard's characteristic attempt at concealment. All of this is here. All of this is. The animal that made it is nearby, somewhere on these slopes, in some fold of the terrain that renders it invisible, despite being perhaps only a few hundred meters away. It is resting, or watching, or moving through terrain that offers it the cover that its hunting requires. It is alive and healthy, and going about the business of being a snow leopard with the complete, undistracted efficiency of an animal that has no concerns beyond the immediate demands of survival. That is enough. For now, that is enough. The rest, the conservation programs, the scientific research, the community engagement, the policy advocacy, the funding negotiations, the international diplomacy, the long argument with the human species about its obligations to the natural world, all of that is the context in which we try to ensure that what is here today is still here tomorrow, and the day after, and the decade after, and the century after. The animal itself is simply here, complete, sufficient, needing nothing from us at this moment except the space to continue. That is the request the mountains make. That is the request that every track in the snow, every scrape mark on the rock, every camera trap image flickering on a researcher's laptop in a cold tent at 4,000 meters is making to anyone willing to hear it. The ghost is real. Let it live.